Welcome to All Saints Church. I'm Ed Bacon, the senior pastor or rector here. On behalf of all the people of All Saints, we welcome you. I am very grateful for tonight. My entire career has been shaped and formed by Dominic Crossan, and he is in my pantheon. So to have him in, quote-unquote, my church is a moment for me. So I hope that if you pass me on the campus and I look like maybe I've been taken up into seventh heaven, it is simply because I am enthralled with the idea that Dom Crossan is in our orbit here at All Saints this weekend. I also want to express some gratitude for some other people. You will learn very, very quickly that this weekend is only possible because the Progressive Christians Uniting organization and David and Debo Dykes and the Dykes Foundation came together with us here at All Saints to jointly sponsor this. It is a weekend full of not only education, but I think transformation and I think holy subversion as well. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful when those things happen. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the work of PCU and the Dykes Foundation. Before I pass this mic on so we can get going, I also want to express my gratitude to my staff colleagues. We had kind of one of those Hollywood funerals here this afternoon at 1 p.m., Hollywood/Pasadena, with almost 1,000 people, and it went almost until 3 o'clock. And this entire campus had to be transformed so that we could accommodate this magnificent conference this weekend. It simply would not have happened without my colleagues who were on the custodial staff. And I would love for you to join me in thanking them right now for all of their very, very hard work. There are other members of my staff who've worked diligently to get us ready for this. Their names are too long to list, and then there's always the inevitable forgetting of somebody, and then having lots of ouches, and then I have to do all sorts of relational work afterwards. So in general, I'm expressing my gratitude to my other staff colleagues. I'm thrilled that in addition to his doing such fruitful work as the executive director of Progressive Christians Uniting, that Peter Larman also is a member of this church. And when he's not speaking on Sunday, he's here in his chair, which is the third chair from the left, third row back. Without further ado, will you please warmly welcome my colleague, my buddy, and the president of PCU, Peter Larman.
Thank you, Ed, so much. I like that theme of holy subversion, and we'll hear a great deal more of that as we go forward. I'm not the president, I'm the executive director, and that's a reminder to me to thank and welcome the many board members of PCU, headed by Bob Long, but there are many others here. There are 10 board members here, and staff, and volunteers, so I invite a word of appreciation for them as well. Thank you. And so I stand here trembling a little bit. I'm trembling on account of the theological journey that we are going to take into territory that is going to be a little bit uncomfortable, I think, but in a good way. We are aiming here, our goals for this gathering are to learn and to struggle together to be living in truth. To be living in truth in a time that's acutely unsettling and very difficult for our sisters and brothers, our neighbors here and around the world. You heard the news reports, and I won't belabor them, about the extent of poverty in suburbs in Southern California. We know about urban poverty. We're learning about the near extinction of what we used to take to be stable arrangements, stable social arrangements and institutions. So that itself is theological in a very important way. And the challenge for us, really, is to move ourselves out of our comfort zones and out of our comfortable assumptions to the place where God awaits us, and really to the place where new life awaits us. So this is what we'll be about together. And I want to say that we can't do this work unless we're together in gatherings like this. So this will be an interactive seminar. This is going to be interactive theology. It's not going to be, we have distinguished theologians with us, but it's not going to be you're passive out there and the theologians are giving you their latest insights. No, we are going to uncover new insights together. That's really the delicious part of this work. So there are aspects of it that are going to be a little unsettling, and there are aspects that are going to be quite delicious as we do the work together. Speaking of collaborations, I do want to say that our agency, Progressive Christians Uniting, is so grateful to this institution, a primary partner, but also to partners around the country who have joined forces with us to begin to create from fragments of progressive Christian formations in the country something bigger than simply the sum of its parts, something that actually functions as a delivery system for better organizing, for better communication, for better training of leaders. And so I'm pleased to recognize just a couple of the people who made a journey from other parts of the country. I want to acknowledge Cynthia Assel from the Progressive Christian Magazine. Cynthia, I know you're in the house somewhere. Cynthia, please stand. And also James Gertmenian. Stay standing, would you? Jim, where are you? You're right in front of me. Jim is the pastor of the Plymouth Congregational Church, a powerhouse progressive Christian center in Minnesota, and also is the founding director of the Center for Progressive Christian Faith, and a dear, dear friend. And there are others. My successor at Judson Church in New York got stranded at Newark Airport today. She was on her way here and Donna Scopper sends her blessings for this gathering. So let me, without further ado then, say that we'll shape our time together in a serious way. We won't waste your time. And the people I've come to rely upon in many ways for keeping me on my theological toes are David and Debo Dykes, whom Ed mentioned. We had the good fortune to be, many of us in the progressive Christian world, to be invited some years ago to really sit and reason together about what we could do in Texas. And David and Debo were part of that, and that has grown. And we were in Minnesota at Jim's invitation recently. We were in Chicago before then. There are people like us all over the country doing the work we're doing, and none better than the good people of the Dykes Foundation. So without further ado, David Dykes, would you come forward, please? And David will introduce our speakers. Thank you so very much for being here.
That was further ado. But anyway, it's such an honor to be here with you tonight at this fine All Saints Church with its wonderful reputation down through the years for progressive thought, leadership, to be with Ed Bacon and his marvelous staff that has been so helpful, and to once again be with our good friend and colleague Peter Lehrman and all the fine folks with PCU. There's so many people I would like to recognize. I know that that's my problem, not yours, and so I'm going to give you what you want. Tonight we get the pleasure and the risk of hearing John Dominic Crossan and Jorg Rieger. And you never are quite safe when you go to a seminar where they're both speaking together. If one misses that side of your head, the other one will slap you on the back of the head. So, but they really need no real introduction, and this is not a formal occasion. In fact, we're hoping for a very informal and colloquial experience. You know about John Dominic Crossan. Many of you know about Jorg Rieger. Jorg is Wendland Cook Professor of Constructive Theology at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. If you know anything at all about the life of Southern Methodist, you know that in recent years it has had the challenge of housing such institutions as the Bush Memorial Library, not memorial, presidential. That was not an intentional slip of the tongue. Jorg is a progressive theologian who literally is on that firing line every day. Dom has the same kind of history over time as Professor Emeritus of DePaul University. Both are seasoned teachers, researchers, scholars, writers, lecturers. It's our deep pleasure and excitement to have them with us tonight. I have the pleasure of also being indulged that the Dykes Foundation, among other things, creates video programming for use in education programs within churches. We are launching early next year a new series featuring John Dominic Crossan called The Challenge of Jesus. This is a different kind of approach to using video for education. What we've tried to do is take the absolute cutting-edge scholarship of John Dominic Crossan and combine that with good video production values that illustrate and expand the terrific content of his work. So they've allowed me to show you this 4-minute promo, okay? We're not going to pass the hat, all right? And we're not going to bow in prayer and ask for love offering. We just want you to know about it. I also want to announce that Jorg Rieger has agreed to participate in a series that will feature himself, and we will take the same approach. Sister Joan Chittister has also committed to this new paradigm series. So if you'll give me just a minute, I'm going to set up this DVD. It's only 4 minutes, and then John Dominic Crossan is going to take over.
I'm going to have 4 themes: the world of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. And there'll be a prologue before it. And each of those themes is going to be divided into 15-minute segments. So I begin with the prologue. And the prologue is to the whole, to everything, to all of the themes. I want to introduce a very important word, crucial word for me. The word is matrix. Matrix. I use it to avoid terms like foreground and background. Foreground and background. It came to me one night after I was signing books, and a lady came up to me and gave me a very beatific smile, and she said, "That was lovely background." And I knew she meant it was quite irrelevant. Background and foreground are not interactive with one another. If you went to get the photograph taken, your portrait taken, you went to the studio and the photographer said, "What would you like as background?" I can put you in front of a beautiful Himalayan mountain, icy cold. I can put you in front of a warm Caribbean beach. The point is, you won't feel warm on the beach or cold on the mountain. Of course not. They're not interactive. So I don't want to use background, because when I'm talking about the world of Jesus, it ain't background you can skip. Imagine I came to you tonight and said, I'm going to talk to you about Martin Luther King Jr. But let's skip all that background stuff about American racism. You know you couldn't do it. It's not background, it's matrix. Let me talk to you about Mahatma Gandhi, but nothing about British imperialism. That's just background. No, it's not. It's matrix. Matrix cannot be skipped. I don't even want to use context and text, because for 2,000 years with Jesus, we've been doing a marvelous job of reading text and ignoring context. So I want a single word: matrix. Matrix is everything you have to know to make sense of Jesus. Jesus back in his own world. Matrix is everything involved. Jesus changes Judaism. Judaism changes Jesus. Judaism changes the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire changes. Everything is interactive. So matrix is a single word. The only alternative is another matrix somewhere else. Matrix is everything that's interactive to understand Jesus. And to summarize it for the moment, and we have to unpack this as we go across the four themes. Jesus is a homeland Jew, not like Paul, a diaspora Jew, a homeland Jew within eschatological Judaism against Roman imperialism.
It is a very great pleasure and a high honor to be with you this weekend in this beautiful church, especially with Jörg Rieger and under the auspices of the Dykes Foundation. Let me begin with a short autobiographical prologue. The name John Dominic Crossan, the reason I use the triple name is that when I was 16 years of age, way back in 1950, I entered a Roman Catholic monastery. And when you do that, they wipe out your past. Like in the Bible, you get new vocation, new name. And I came in as John Crossan, and I then was Brother Dominic. 19 years later, when I left, having finally realized that celibacy was vastly overrated, I wanted to make a statement that I wouldn't dare change a single thing. I would come in, whatever it was, 16, and leave it, whatever, 35. So I put Dominic in the middle. It has no legal standing. The government knows me as John, and God knows me as Dominic, and they have not been speaking to one another for a few years now. So there's no confusion at all. Tonight I want to talk about God and justice. I talked about God and the justice of equality. Hold that word for a while. We'll have to explore it a bit. Let me think. In December of 1965, between Christmas and New Year's, I was at the French School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. It's called in French the École Biblique. We called it the Cold and Bleak, because it was like a medieval castle. In the summer, it felt like it was air-conditioned. In the winter, it felt like it was air-conditioned. You froze. But the group of us went down to Sinai. And remember, please, this was 65. We went down to Sinai to go to Mount Catherine's. We were in a squad of 9 cars, which were described as desert-proof, which, as far as I could figure out, meant that if they got lost, nobody would care. But anyway. So we barreled across the hardened sand. There weren't roads where we were going in those days. And every now and then, every half hour, we'd stop to make certain that the last car was still back there in the dust behind us. Finally got to Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's around 3 p.m. We left Suez around 3 in the morning to cross before the boats started coming through. I suppose my excuse might be we were giddy after a day in the sun, so we saw a bush there. We were parked outside the monastery waiting to be allowed in. We were sleeping in the dormitory inside the monastery. And we decided to set the bush on fire. Yeah, idiots. Well, it burned. When it was finished, there was no bush. Now, of course, that's the point of Moses at the burning bush. It didn't consume. It's a paradox. How can you have a burning bush that doesn't consume? If it consumes, it's burning. If it's not consumed, how can you have both? How can you have a burning, non-burning, a consuming, non-consuming bush? It's a visual paradox. And Moses is going to get hit with a verbal paradox. which is the most important thing to say whenever you talk about God. God says, first of all, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm coming because I've heard the sufferings of my people by their oppressors in Egypt. I'm going to liberate them from Egypt and take them to the promised land. So far, it's clear enough. Then Moses said, yeah, but what's your name? And then God says, in effect, my name is the unnameable one. Yeah, that's kind of an answer. You could say, oh, unnameable one. It's a paradox. My name is the unnameable one. But then immediately afterwards, God goes right back as if nothing has been said and said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm coming to liberate my people from their oppressor and take them to the promised land. That's my name forever. You want to say, excuse me, now which is it? And that's the point of that revelation. The name of God cannot be uttered. The name of God must be named. Cannot be named, must be named. That makes no sense. Yeah, neither does a burning bush that doesn't get burned. The most important thing then is that we must name God. And we must know it is never, ever inadequate. And that's not an excuse for not doing it. So, think about it. Where did these people get this weird idea that God cared about liberating them from Egypt? I mean, it's not self-evident. There's lots of poor people, small, if you even want to think of it as a country later, small, battered people who don't think God is actually on their side. I mean, all the evidence would seem to go in the opposite direction. So where did they get this absolutely weird idea? And it is weird. Where did they get it? It's so easy to say to us, scholars, you're just taking modern ideas about democratic principles or human rights and you're dumping them back in the first millennium or the first century among people who had no ideas like that. This is all liberalism or socialism or, oh my God, communism. Where did they get it? Where did the people in the biblical tradition get their vision of God? And don't think for a second, it's enough to say, well, it's monotheism. You could have lots of different monotheists. Where did they get the idea that God was into liberation and cared about the sufferings of people? And it's not at all clear, if they had been doing the same to the Egyptians and the roles had been reversed, that God would have been on the side of the Egyptians. They got their vision from the most simplest way you could imagine. Every human being, pretty much growing up, knows what a well-run household is like. Maybe because they have lived in one, or maybe because they have not lived in one. They know what a well-run household is like. They have some idea of what a good householder is like. Now, an aside. If you're living in the Mediterranean world, you have this magnificent illusion that the householder is called the father. Anyone who knows the Mediterranean world, maybe a lot of other ones as well, knows it's not the father who runs the household, it's the mother. That is why even if you have a band called ABBA, when it makes a musical, it's not called Papa Mia, it's called Mama Mia. So, when you hear the term father in the Bible, or in, for example, especially the Our Father, in your mind, cross out that word and hear householder. And don't make the mistake of thinking that the householder is always masculine. That is simply a prejudice of patriarchal presuppositions. So here's their vision. Here's the way they're thinking. And it's terribly simple. Supposing you wandered into a peasant's house, a courtyard house in Galilee at the time of Jesus. How would you judge the householder? Think how simple it is. You'd look around at the fields. Nice job, well taken care of. How about the animals? Do they look like they're provisioned properly? How about inside the house? Are the children well fed, well clothed, well sheltered? Does it look like a sick child is getting special care? Or a pregnant mother is getting special concern? If you're saying yes, yes to yourself, then you would praise the name of the householder, which is why the very first thing in the Our Father, after the word Father is mentioned, you're talking about the name, hallowing the name of God. Now, supposing you went into a household, and it would make no difference whether it's a royal palace or a peasant hut, and you found half the kids starving and the other half overfed. What would you think of that householder? All right, 10% of the kids starving and 90% overfed. One starving and the other overfed. Think of how horrified you'd be. Ancient world, modern world. Royal palace, peasant's hut. I let you in on a secret. There is no preferential option for the poor in the Bible. In fact, the Bible, first of all, is not big on preferential options. It's much bigger on prophetic demands. There's no evidence in the Bible that if everyone was poor, equally poor, we're not talking about suffering, we're just talking about being poor. For example, when the people are coming in the Exodus through the desert, and they're just making it from manna to manana, as it were. And nobody's talking about poverty. What appalls the Bible, what appalls the Bible's vision of God, is inequality. The crass inequality where some are overfed while others are starving. That horrifies the Bible. And I think we can understand why it horrifies the Bible. Because it would horrify anyone who walked into a home and found it. Today we would take all the kids away. So to try and start thinking like the Bible, I don't even want to use the word social justice anymore. They're really not thinking social justice, they're thinking divine justice. They're thinking of God as the householder of the world, the homemaker of the home earth, as it were. And it's as if they were saying to God, okay, well, how's that going for you? And of course they're horrified.
Isn't that you, Dr. Crossan?
No, I presume it's applause. They'd be horrified at that inequality. That's their entire basis for understanding everything. And when they come to have a king, they're going to use the same thing. So when, for example, the Bible says, and it says repeatedly, God is a God of justice and righteousness. First of all, that's biblical redundancy, or if you prefer, poetic parallelism. That means the same thing. And don't think it's talking about retributive, punitive justice. It is talking about distributive or restorative justice. Their vision is terribly, terribly clear. Terribly clear. Where in this world is justice? And what it bothers them is it embarrasses God. How awful for you, householder in heaven, that your earth is in such a mess. Don't let people use the term social justice. We're really talking about divine justice. And divine justice is social justice on steroids. It's everything we could ever imagine and more. Let me point to a place where you can see this most clearly in the whole Bible. Somewhat arbitrary. Psalm 82. Psalm 82. It's a beautiful psalm because it imagines God seated in heaven, surrounded by all the gods and goddesses who run the world. It's quite lovely. It's like a CEO sitting down with upper management. Unfortunately, of course, it is about a new concept in downsizing, namely firing upper management. No comment on that. God indicts the powers that be because they have not observed the right of the needy and the lowly. We're not talking about charity. We're talking about rights. And of course, that's what you would say. You would think every child in a family has a right to at least a fair share. And when God indicts the powers that be for not maintaining the right of the lowly and the needy, it says they don't even know what he's talking about. They walk around in darkness. They don't even make excuses. It's like whoever said anything about justice, we thought it was about power. Whoever brought up this justice thing, where's that in the job description? And then comes the scariest line in the entire Bible, and also the most accurate. Because you're waiting for God to say, I'm going to punish you people for what you do. All it says is, injustice shakes the foundations of the earth. And there's nothing there, but don't worry, says God, I'll fix you up. Injustice shakes the foundations of the earth. We don't get away with it. Don't let anyone tell you that this vision of the world is communism or socialism or liberalism. If you have to have an ism, welcome back. If you have to have an ism, it is Godism. And ask them, do they have a problem with God? Or it's Bibleism. Or householderism. Or the word I've been starting to use more and more, it's really enoughism. Because I've been using the word egalitarianism and equality, and they're perfectly valid words under certain circumstances. But in a household, it's not that everyone gets exactly the same. But the rock bottom basic is, first of all, everyone gets enough. Enoughism is what we're talking about. So the vision we're going to explore in what I'm doing, these lectures. I should tell you honestly, what I want to do is create a new biblical theology for Christianity. Now, isn't that an impertinent thing to dare to say? And the only reason I would dare to say it is I am completely convinced I am not renewing it, I am re-olding it. I am absolutely convinced that if you have a problem with that, take it up with the Bible and with God. It's all over the Bible, and it's the basis of the Bible itself. God is the householder of the world house. We won't talk much about the king is the householder of the land. And as you would find any well-run house, how should God's world be? And if it is not, there's no hint that God's going to punish us. It will not work. It will not work. It's as if you made your own boat in your garage and took it out to sea, and after a while it started to sink. And don't say the sea is punishing you. Just do hope you can swim. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I forgot. I almost forgot completely. I want to conclude by showing a short video. So I'd ask Sarah, please, would you turn on the projector, please, dear? I want to show you a short video that really says much the same as I've been saying, but visually. It's based on work by two epidemiologists, not theologians or philosophers, but epidemiologists, who wanted to try and figure out why, if you compared the 23 richest countries in the world, now just the richest, not rich and poor, 23 richest countries in the world, if you compared them, how would you find out which had more health and social problems? And how does that correlate with income inequality? That's what they set out to do. If you want to read the book on which this is based, it's called The Spirit Level. It's a pun, obviously. The Spirit Level. And you can find it on the Equality Trust on the web. You can also see the video which I'm going to show you, which Sarah created. You can see it on YouTube. If you go into YouTube and in the search slot put in 4 words, divine justice, human injustice, you'll be able to see what we're showing. I'd like to thank my beloved Sarah for that beautiful work. Sad. Sad.
It's a privilege to be here tonight. I come from the state of Texas that was on that scale fairly high up, talking about inequality and at the same time social problems, how these things are related. When I introduce myself in travels around the world, I often say I come from the belly of the beast. And perhaps here in California this may feel like it is a joke, but if you live in Texas, and I've lived and taught there for 16 years, I think you get an idea of the sorts of things that I might be talking about. We do have a progressive Christian movement in Texas. We have the so-called Progressive Christian Center in the South, which is also co-sponsored by the Dykes Foundation. And I've often thought that if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. So there's hope, it seems to me. If things can happen in Texas, they can happen perhaps more easily elsewhere. But that's what we're working towards. That's what we're hoping for. It's also a privilege to be here working again with Dominic Crossan. We started doing this last year, and one thing I really appreciate about Dom is that he doesn't mind me saying things that a lot of my colleagues do mind me saying. And so it's wonderful to have this working relationship where we oftentimes play off each other and relate to some of the things that make up our work as theologians and as scholars. Tonight I want to talk about Christ and Empire, the radical Christian heritage. Let me see here if I can somehow adjust the light here at my lectern a little bit. There are some people who think that all this talk about empire is nothing more than a fad, something that will go away when the next fad comes rolling around. It would, of course, be wonderful if this were the case, but I'm afraid this is not going to happen so soon. Empire is not a fad that will go away quickly. Let me make 2 points in this regard. First of all, we need to remember that Christianity has shaped up in a context of empire for 2,000 years. And for almost 1,700 years of those 2,000, Christianity has been the dominant religion in the context of empire. This is something that you shouldn't take lightly, because it's not just that we shape the empire, it's also that the empire shapes us. That's, of course, the problem with empire. It's not simply that it's a political phenomenon, that it has to do with economics, but that it shapes the way we think, it shapes the way we do things, it shapes us deep down, it shapes our emotions, and as Christians we have to confess that it even shapes our beliefs. Once this is clear, we can also ask the other question: what difference Christianity really makes? And here's the good news. It seems to me that while we have been shaped by empire for 2,000 years, Christianity has never been taken up by empire altogether, and Christianity has kept resisting. This is what I want to talk about tonight. But in talking about this, I do not want to offer simply a couple of good ideas. That's sometimes the thing that theologians are doing. You know, here's a great idea, there's a great idea, let's all be proud of this. I want to talk about realities. I want to talk about alternative aspects of the Christian tradition which are real. I want to talk about alternative forms of power which are real, not just ideas. And in this context, we have to talk about alternative movements, which are perhaps more real than anything in this world. You have to keep in mind the empire wants to present itself as real, but empires end, empires fail. Empires do not last forever. It is these alternative movements, however, that we need to pay attention to. A couple of these movements, as you may recall from history, have made a tremendous difference in the United States. And these are all movements, not simply anti-empire, but these are movements that tie religion, Christianity, and some of the other religions together with alternatives and resistance to empire. There's the women's movement, which doesn't go back only to the 1960s, as some people think, but goes back to the 1800s. Very much related to Christian ideas. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing the Women's Bible. Sojourner Truth preaching as a Methodist, as an abolitionist. There's the Civil Rights Movement, which brings together religion and resistance to empire in new ways. Martin Luther King, of course, you can see on these pictures. There are many other stories to be told. Understand that some of you here were very instrumental in this movement. Today, one of the new budding movements that we haven't paid enough attention to yet is the religion and labor movement. Some of this happening in this very city of Los Angeles. You might be surprised that even in my part of the world, this religion and labor movement is picking up. And we're looking back to a 100-year history where in North Texas and southeastern Oklahoma, about 100 years ago, they used to have camp meetings of 10,000 people gathering together, which is nothing special. You have these large camp meetings, of course, in the South, all over the map. Except that these camp meetings in North Texas and southeastern Oklahoma 100 years ago were camp meetings of Christian socialists who brought together issues of labor and religion. A lot of people don't remember it, and those who know about it these days would like to forget about it. But here's hope. This is the actual reality that I want to talk about. Let me add a brief word about empire. Empires, of course, come in all kinds, forms and shapes. What is the bad thing about empires? Well, first of all, it seems to me one of the key problems is that empire is trying to control all of life. Not simply trying to control politics, not simply trying to play economics, it's trying to shape us deep down to our very core. And in doing that, the empire wants us to believe there is no alternative. That's the way it's going to be. There will be no transformation. Furthermore, empires concentrate wealth and power at the top in the hands of a few. Power flows from the top down. There is no alternative to this power. And wealth follows suit. The majority of humanity in this context does not benefit. Of course, empires change throughout history. There's the Roman Empire, there's the Middle Ages in Europe. You have the Spanish conquest, you have European colonialism, you have British colonialism, and now you have what I sometimes call post-colonial empires that still do the business of empire undercover. We do not call it colonialism anymore. We might call it civilization, development, but these are the sorts of empires that we have to address today. Some of these empires work via hard power, through military, through force, through harsh politics. Some of them worked through soft power, by simply trying to persuade people, by preaching, by going out there and patronizing people, perhaps. But there's good news. This is what I want to focus on. In the midst of each of these empires, there is an alternative. While empire has shaped Christianity, it has never been able to take over altogether. There are alternative movements in history, and Christianity has oftentimes been very closely related to them. I want to give you one example tonight that might surprise you, except that we're here in an Episcopal church. I want to talk about the Nicene Creed. And if you think about it, this might be the proverbial empire creed. The Council of Nicaea was brought together by the first Christian Roman emperor by the name of Constantine, the year 325. It was the sort of creed that had all the trappings and all the trimmings of the empire. But the amazing thing is that even in this creed, there's a resistance movement breaking through. There's an alternative. Let me describe first a little bit about what this empire creed looks like and what some of it implied. And then I really want to focus on what this alternative is like. In 325, the Emperor Constantine, trying to unify the empire, realized that he needed something more than simply the military and political savvy. Religion was a convenient thing to bring the empire together. Here, a unified creed for all of the empire would do a great service. To define the Christian God in terms of the interests of the empire, of course, was Constantine's prime objective. And how could this be done? Well, the way it happened, Constantine called this council, he brought the bishops together, he paid for their transportation, he put them up, he made them feel comfortable, he organized their meetings, he presided their meetings, and he even had the final theological say. It's always a good idea to pay attention to who pays for your travels. And to see what it is that people want from you. Now, this is one reason why I deeply appreciate the Dykes Foundation and PCU and the invitations to come here, because it makes a difference who pays for your travel. Constantine, in this regard, of course, was no different. By bringing together the bishops, by developing this unifying creed, he thought perhaps he could control the empire just a little bit better and more effectively. And so, in this creed, they were all talking Greek at those times. He suggested a little phrase called homoousios to patri, which sounds harmless enough. Simply talks about Jesus being of the same substance as God the Father. This is part, of course, for those of you who recite the Nicene Creed on a regular basis, of the Creed, talking about how Christ is of the same substance as God the Father. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made, the Creed says. Let's take a quick look at what was at stake here. The opponent here was a person called Arius, a theologian who argued that Jesus was indeed very, very special, but not exactly at the level of God. Why was this so important to Arius? Well, some people thought maybe he was a liberal who just had a little trouble affirming the divinity of Jesus. He wanted to, see him as very special, as a prophet, as a good person, but couldn't quite affirm the divinity. My reading is different. What Arius wanted to preserve was not the humanity of Jesus, but he wanted to preserve the top-down divinity of God. And that's easier if you have one guy at the top who calls all the shots, if you have somebody whom you can consider as immutable, impassible, sitting on a throne. And by keeping Jesus out of the game. It's safer that way for sure, right? Because once you add this figure of Jesus into the divinity, you start messing things up. You start creating problems for your empire god. You start raising some questions that you'd rather not raise. So Arius was another empire theologian. Now, Constantine thought that he could resolve the same problem in a different way. He thought that perhaps by integrating Jesus into the empire image of God, he could domesticate the guy. He could domesticate Jesus in such a way that Jesus now also became all-powerful, impassible, immutable, sitting on a throne, not creating any trouble. So homoousios to patri for Constantine meant we now get rid of this Jesus problem by simply making Jesus another empire idol. However, there's another way of reading this, and this is what I want to emphasize here. Because you can read this creed both ways. You can either say that the emperor God determines who Jesus is, thereby domesticating Jesus. Or you can say that perhaps Jesus calls into question our empire images of God. And here's the good news. What if the Jesus figure wasn't domesticated after all? What if Jesus, brought together with God in one substance, called into question our images of God? So what happens if you read the Nicene Creed against the grain? The co-equality of Jesus and God now all of a sudden means that we might have to rethink who God is from the bottom up. Empire theology no longer rules the day, but an alternative theology now has to be brought into our conceptions of God. The theology of resistance to empire takes a root here. The real question, of course, is who is this Jesus that we're talking about? And my colleague Dominic Crossan has done a great deal of research. What if this Jesus now reshaped our images of God? Of course, the Nicene Creed leaves these questions out. If you remember the Creed, and it's the same in the Apostles' Creed, it doesn't recall the stories of Jesus. It doesn't talk about the ministry of Jesus. It moves between these things. It leaves them out. It neglects them. And so, most people who recite the Creed have their own harmless little Jesus images in the back of their mind. The meek and gentle Savior, the person with long, light hair and blue eyes. You know these images from Sunday school, right? I've grown up with them in Germany for many years. Or simply an irrelevant religious figure who constantly looks up to heaven and therefore also keeps looking up to the powers that be, praying to them, as it were. These days we've actualized some of these old images of Jesus. There are books out that talk about Jesus as a CEO, that talk about Jesus' management practices, talking about Jesus' ability to lead the government, to lead big business. I will talk about some of these tomorrow. But this is, of course, nothing like what we know about Jesus. There's an alternative image about Jesus who, as we all know from the gospel, was a worker. Well, we say carpenter, and sometimes we get the mistaken idea that Jesus was somebody who had a little woodwork shop, perhaps a little store right next door, where they sell the products, somebody who belonged to the middle class. But what the Gospels tell us was that Jesus is more something like a day laborer in construction, a construction worker, somebody who actually does hard physical labor and whose labor is exploited by the powers that be. What we know about Jesus is that he was not born in a palace, that he wasn't the kid of the... I'm sorry? Oh, very good. Should we pause for a moment? As long as everything is taken care of. Well, thanks, I appreciate that. The images of Jesus that, of course, we could go on describing and that you see on the screen here to some degree, conflict with most of the images that we have created in our empire theologies, in our 2,000 years of trying to domesticate Jesus and trying to reconcile him with an empire image of God who works from the top down. What we know about Jesus is different. He's one who hangs out with the common people, somebody who gets in conflict with those in power, whether those are people in politics or religion or economic figures of the day. And perhaps the thing that we've often forgotten about Jesus, not only does he hang out with the common people, he organizes them. He brings them together. He builds something that's not simply, an individual project. That's not simply a couple of groups here and there that do crazy stuff. He brings them together for the common good in such a way that he becomes a threat to the empire very early on, not only at the end of his ministry, but early on. There's a reference in the Gospel of Mark where the Pharisees and the Herodians conspire together to destroy Jesus. What is interesting here, of course, is that this Christian heritage could not be domesticated by the empire. Despite all these efforts, despite 2,000 years of attempts to domesticate Jesus, he could not be domesticated. And he keeps popping up in these movements. He keeps popping up in the various movements I described earlier. And what we're here doing this weekend is wondering how Jesus keeps popping up again in our own time, in the sorts of movements that we are experiencing, that we are finding in our own world. In this regard, the Nicene Creed reminds us of something important. Saying that Jesus is not simply a great prophet or a very good person or maybe very, very special, but saying that Jesus, in this Jesus, God's self becomes visible, deconstructs our empire images of God in a new way. I think this is the justice of God on steroids, the way Dom has described it. This is something that's extremely powerful, and sometimes liberal Christians neglect that. When we think of Jesus as a very good person, as somebody who made a tremendous difference, without reconstructing our images of God, we leave untouched the heart of reality that is determined by the way the empire functions. So by not moving this thing back in our images of God, by not moving the ministry of Jesus back into the core of what drives the world, the empire wins. Too many of my students, when I try to see what is it they're thinking, have already bought into the message of the empire that there is no alternative. There is no alternative to what's going on. Tomorrow I will talk more specifically about how the economy shapes up in this regard. But this is what we're supposed to believe, that capitalism is here to stay, that the economic system, the empire in which we find ourselves, is at the end of history. But if this were true, we'd be living in the kingdom of God. And I pray every day that this is not the end of history, that there is something to come yet. And the thing that's to come may not be the world burning up in flames, which, by the way, many of my students find fairly easy to imagine. They can very easily imagine the world going up in flames, but they have the hardest time imagining that capitalism could end. It's an interesting sort of relationship. You should think about it. Perhaps we should think about the alternatives a little bit more seriously. There's a fundamental change that takes place, and I think the Nicene Creed might lead us in this direction. We're now no longer talking about simply social justice and the sorts of things that we can do. We're talking about what is at the core of reality. Therefore, talking about divine justice. We're talking about what is it that God is up to. And perhaps our images of Jesus, some of which you have on this screen, can help us rethink this. This is not simply a theological exercise. This is the sort of thing that might actually help us make a difference in this world. This is the sort of thing that might help us defeat the purposes of the empire. This is the sort of thing that might help us develop some antibodies to the ideology that we're presented with every day, as if there was no alternative and capitalism was here to stay. The question then, of course, when we start reconstructing our images of God is also, how are we reconstructing our images of the world? How are we rethinking the sorts of things that we're made to believe are possible and impossible? If 100 years ago in North Texas and southeastern Oklahoma you could have camp meetings with 10,000 people talking about the burning issues of the day, imagine what we could do now. Imagine the sorts of things, if we were working together as progressives, we could change, the sorts of things, the sorts of differences we could make in our own context. This is the sort of thing I would like us to envision this weekend. I have a few ideas. We'll talk about this in our discussions. But I'm also interested in the sorts of ideas that you have. And then we're not just talking about ideas, we're talking about the realities that we're observing. There's a lot more happening in this world than the powers that be want us to know. And this is perhaps the power of theology, that we can describe the sorts of things that are happening that are not quite seen yet, that are not quite on the big screens yet. But what if we're the ones putting them there? What if we're the ones putting out the word and witnessing to that reality that cannot be suppressed by empire? This is why I do what I'm doing and why I keep doing what I'm doing. For 16 years in Texas, and if necessary, another 16, and then another 16. For the sake of time, let me conclude at this point, emphasizing that we'll talk more specifically about the economy tomorrow. The sorts of things that you have seen in Dominic Crossan's presentation are mind-boggling. Those are the sorts of things we have to let sink in. Perhaps tonight is a good time to let this happen, and then to see what is it that we can do about it. And for me as a theologian, the question is, what is God doing about it? How is the reality of this world different than this? Thank you very much.
did say we did say we would Thank you. I'm sorry. We did say we'd be a little bit interactive, and so I want us to spend a little bit of this precious time together interrogating our theologians a little bit. I will, forgive the expression, I want to begin with Dom. Very quickly, Dom, how often is it that you discover that you are...
This way so we can see everyone.
How often do you discover that people are saying to you, aha, you are a liberal and you are back, that your theological work is a back formation of your liberal perspective? And why are conservative critics of your work so at pains to insist upon that? Could you address that for a minute?
You mean there's critics of my work?
Oh, yes.
Oh. My way of answering that is, let's talk about the Pledge of Allegiance. Let me see. Do you have a problem with liberty and justice for all? That's what. Wait a minute. It's in the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm quite happy with the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't think we need a new pledge for America. I think the pledge we got is just doing fine. So that's my answer to them. What do you call the Pledge of Allegiance, where under God we're supposed to have liberty and justice for all? I don't see the Bible saying an awful lot more than liberty and justice for all under God. I mean, that's as good a summary as I know. So I would simply say, well, do you think the Pledge of Allegiance is actually communism or socialism or liberalism? Then if you can answer me that, then I can tell you what I'm doing. I'm just unpacking the Pledge of Allegiance.
Lovely, lovely. And very quickly, Jörg, for you. You said early on in your presentation that empire gets in here, that it's not just out here in our economic arrangements, that it's in here. Can you say a little bit more? Can I draw you out a little bit more on how we become domesticated to empire?
See, I think this is the real problem with empire and economics. I'll talk about this problem tomorrow, that these powers are not simply satisfied with ruling us every day and having us follow their directives. They want to shape us in very different kinds and ways, and in terms of different sorts of humans. Talk about power, for instance. When we talk about power, of course, as Christians, we talk about God's power. Where do we look? Immediately, we're drawn up. Immediately, we're looking in terms of the heavens, the skies, but also in terms of the wealthy, the powerful, people who are functioning at these other levels of reality that we usually don't function at. Now, the empire has us trained in such a way that this feels natural. For Christians, it feels natural to lift our eyes not just to the skies, but also to the upper levels of society, to the upper levels of politics, to the upper levels of economics, and to look for our solutions there. Now, if you follow the heritage of Jesus, this would not be natural. It would be much more natural to look at what's happening on the dusty roads of Galilee, what is happening as the people gather, what is happening when power shapes up not from the top down, but from the bottom up. It's come to such a situation now that power for us in general seems to be top down. And when people criticize top down power, then it seems like we're rejecting power altogether. What I'm suggesting is, what if the alternative were not rejecting power, but looking for bottom-up power? The empire doesn't allow us to do that. Not just in politics and economics, but even in our daily lives. This is why we have patriarchy. This is why we have all the sorts of hierarchies between the races, between the various classes that shape our society, because we're so much trained to look up. That's just one example. But it gets deep into our bones in such a way that it becomes unconscious. We are not even aware of this anymore. We think this is the way the world goes.
All right, we have microphones on the floor, and I think we have a roving microphone. Do we have a roving microphone? So if you would just put your hand up, and we're going to ask for sharp, short questions, not arias, not lengthy counter presentations. Please, go. I'll bring you a mic.
Thank you. This may be a stupid question, but I looked up the Nicene Creed while you were talking, and I really can't see anything wrong with it. You described it as something which I didn't catch. Perhaps you could fill us in on that. But, I mean, are we wrong? Are we going to kick the Nicene Creed out the door?
Thank you.
Yeah, that is certainly a very good question. Peter, should I go ahead respond?
Go right ahead.
Okay, very good. No, actually, my suggestion was not to kick the Nicene Creed out, but to read it against the grain. My point about it was that if Jesus is seen as of the same substance as God, that was Constantine's idea, that we're talking now about Jesus and God being at the same level, rather than domesticating Jesus, bringing him into the empire God, to rethink God in terms of who Jesus was. And the Nicene Creed allows us to do that. It doesn't restrict us from doing that. It may not encourage us, but it opens that door to such a degree that Constantine, later on in his life, reverted back to Arianism. He realized that Nicaea was too dangerous, perhaps. So what I'm advocating is that as Christians who want to appreciate these traditions, we read them in such a way that we bring him back to the resistance against empire, which is at the core of Christianity, rather than into the support of empire.
And you're right. I mean, it's very important to say that, because it's not said enough. Every Constantine, as soon as it was explained to him afterwards by Eusebius of Nicomedia, that you've just been sideswiped, Your Imperial Highness. If Jesus is consubstantial with God, he's above you. He went Arian immediately. And he died an Arian Christian. And every emperor after him in the 4th century, except Julian, who had his own agenda, was Arian. They saw immediately the implications. That if Jesus represents God, apart from what Jörg said, which is perfectly right, if Jesus represents God, then we see God in Jesus. That puts him kind of above the emperor. So how can a Galilean peasant be above the emperor? So he went Arian.
When I first started going to school, we said the Pledge of Allegiance without the phrase, under God. Liberty and justice for all had nothing to do, at least in school, with God. And the separation of church and state was a very sacred thing. Please explain how God fits into the equation. Is it possible to have liberty and justice without God?
No
Because in this country
problem at all.
for a long time people thought perhaps it might be.
I would say no problem at all. If we establish liberty and justice for all, we'll be under God whether we say it or not. But the argument about whether we should have under God in there is a magnificent transcendental red herring, so we won't talk about liberty and justice. Let's argue about God.
I have a basic question. You know, I'm trying to understand my God in a different way than I did when I was a child. And I remember hearing the beginning of wisdom is fear of God. So how do you see that now? Or does that make sense to you? Or
Well, I would say that the last thing we kept hearing from Jesus was fear not. So Jesus departed this world in a flurry of fear nots, and we've replaced it with a flurry of fear lots. No. There's a reason, things we should be afraid of. I mentioned one tonight, that injustice shakes the foundations of the earth. Yeah, we should be scared of that. That's what we should be scared of. Not that we're going to be punished or something. So there's a few things around that we should be afraid of. We will not get away with injustice. We will not get away with imperialism.
You know, one of the responses to that is also the question, who is God? Who is this God that we're talking about? And too often when we say fear God, we make the unfortunate people who are struggling fear God, and those in power, of course, they're like God. What if it were reversed, and if the ones who would have to fear God would be those in power rather than the powerless, At that point, it turns around in such a way that the Christian God challenges the empire God. And of course, for good reasons, the Christians in the Roman Empire were considered atheists. They weren't even supposed to be believers in God because this God was so different from anything that they had imagined. And what if the emperor then would have to fear that Christian God? That is the question, I think, that is of interest to us. And that might reshape the way we read the Pledge of Allegiance. What God are we talking about? Not the God of the status quo.
Isn't there another difficulty, though, of unpacking the Pledge of Allegiance, and that is your definition of justice? I think there's a great distinction between God's justice and human justice, and I think the justice we operate in this country is that we all have an equal opportunity to be hungry. So isn't the real emphasis on that word and what you mean by it?
Okay. All right, there's two ways of going. We could write philosophical tomes, I have a couple in mind, on the meaning of justice. Justice is when most people say it's just. It's not that mysterious. If you have 100 people, I'll give you 5. If 95 of them say it's just, it probably is. If 5 of them say it's just for the rest, it probably isn't. I think the model of the Bible of the family is fair enough. If most people in the family say this is okay, yeah, it probably is. If you want to get abstract discussion of justice, I'm not saying you're doing this, but be very careful that an abstract discussion of justice and all the options makes it impossible ever to establish justice. But I would say the criterion is very simple. When most people say it is, it probably is. And I'll give you whatever percentage you want of the pale dissatisfied ones who'll never be satisfied. That's all right. They might be precious too. So with 2 or 3 or 4%. What's not just is if 2% dictate to the whole world, and that's about the standard going, what justice is. Of course it's not going to be just. No matter what they say. How could it be?
No, in some ways what you're saying implies also this idea that justice means taking sides, taking the sides of those who experience injustice, and perhaps putting some limits on those who perpetuate injustice.
Yeah.
The biblical notions of justice have to do with restoring community, have to do with God moving in and doing what it takes to restore the widows, the strangers, and the orphans to their place. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means setting some limits to those who benefit from the unjust system.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the framing of the encounter of God and the paradox. With that in mind, my question is a concrete one. We are out to seek justice in a land of an alienation and complete injustice. And we have to, in some ways, do battle with those who would fight against us. And yet, at the same time, we need to work as Jesus would to restore a sense of community, to reach across, as sometimes we've said in this church, across that divide to those on the right. And I have trouble with that paradox, and I'm wondering if both of you could comment on that.
Not certain I understand.
Could you just say one more word about what that paradox is?
Not clear.
I guess we're not quite clear.
Sure. What I mean, the paradox is that in a battle, you create... Oh, sorry. In a battle, you create an enemy almost. The people that are part of the I don't want to use the wrong term, Tea Party, for lack of a better word, versus the idea that we're supposed to see the human in these people. And the paradox then is that we're supposed to reach out to these people, but at the same time we're supposed to do battle with them in a way to create justice. And so I'm wondering concretely how we deal with that paradox?
Theologically, if I look at images of God in the Bible, you oftentimes see God taking sides. This revolutionary song of Mary in the Gospel of Luke at the very beginning talks about God siding with the lowly, pushing the powerful from their throne, filling the hungry with good things, sending the rich away empty. Now, that might look as if God has no concern for the rich, or if it's just a battle that puts other people down. But maybe being sent away hungry once in a while, being pushed down from your throne once in a while, may be a good thing. Maybe an expression of God's love. Justice and love are not opposites here, but this is the way God works. And this is not simply the hope for those who have been oppressed. It may be also the only hope that the oppressors have to lead a more human life.
Yeah, also, we're debating ideas rather than hating people. And in my own experience, I have found in general, liberals are better at debating ideas than conservatives are debating ideas without attacking people. I mean, it's a very delicate thing, but it can be done. But I in my own experience, and I mean personal experience, conservatives are not good at attacking ideas without attacking people. For a long time on the web, I was John Dominic Crossan. That at least had a sense of humor.
I actually think that there's a vision of communism that can be a good thing and actually emancipating for humanity. And to me, the idea of enoughism is actually part of that vision, where enough for the needs, intellectual as well as economic and spiritual and artistic, of every person. The question I have is that I don't think that society can be brought into being simply by redistribution, but more requires the end of capitalism. And so I wanted your thoughts on that question.
Let me say something. Did you notice how relentlessly on those graphs Japan and Sweden kept coming up down in the bottom corner down here, both of whom have absolutely opposed way of handling the situation. Japan primarily by not letting a huge discrepancy be created in the income inequality, and Sweden by letting it do whatever it wants and bringing it back down by taxes. They're exactly the opposite way of redistributing, and they're both down in the bottom corner. So how you do it, that's another question, and that takes economic expertise. Is that an oxymoron? Okay. No, it really does. But if you have a principle that at the end of this we should have the maximum distribution, then it's up to the experts on how to do it. I would not know how to do it if I was put in charge. But we're asking, what would a budget look like if God drew it up? That's what we're simply asking. And we can recognize when it isn't, certainly. Sorry.
We're going to take two more. The evening's getting on toward 9 o'clock, and I can say one thing: there's no justice in the way I administer this microphone, and you'll all concur with that. Where are you?
The charts were based on a book, I think, that was shown over there, and I noticed that there was an introduction by Robert Reich. Robert Reich did a lot in order for those gaps to exist. He worked with Clinton, and during the Clinton administration, the ceilings for the executives of big corporations were taken off. And my question is, how can we keep on working against the likes of Reich, who present themselves as being on our side in a book like that one, when in fact they have boldly worked on the other side?
To be honest with you, I didn't know that, first of all. In the book itself, we only took 5 examples. Every one of them is also done for the 50 states, every single case, which kind of corroborates it. So the graphs in the book are done by other people and by scientists and all the rest of it. I don't know about who he was. I didn't even know who he was.
Bob Reich.
Sorry, my ignorance.
I think Bob Reich was kind of an exile inside of the Clinton administration. He's tried to redeem himself since he left. We're going to have one more here, and then we're going to send people out with a blessing.
Dr. Crossan, how are you? My question is this. You just said that conservatives, in your experience, have a difficult time reasoning with people and not attacking the person. In other words, they cannot attack the idea without personalizing, attacking the person. Is that correct?
That's my experience. Personally.
So are you saying that Jesus of Nazareth then was a conservative?
Excuse me?
Jesus of Nazareth, according to some books I've read by yourself, was a man who taught with reason, who tried to convince people with reason, but he also attacked individuals, as he did on the temple steps during the Passover, physically attacked people.
No, I'm sorry. But just to get this very straight. In the Gospels...
Would you say he was a conservative?
No. Everyone in the Gospel writers thinks Jesus can do whatever he wants. There is not a single case where Jesus gets into a debate with a Pharisee, for example, which he does with monotonous regularity, and says, I'm going to raise you 50 feet in the air. Now, do you want to continue this argument? Jesus never uses power like that. And the presumption is that he can, at least from the writers. But what is going on, which is much more serious, is that steadily across the Gospel, almost chronologically, Jesus is getting nastier and nastier. Watch it. I mean, if you watch something which is in Mark says, for example, if they don't pay attention to you in a place, just leave it. You know, knock the dust off your feet and leave. That's what Mark says. Matthew says that, copying Mark, and then he says, woe to that city, you're going right down to hell. Tyre and Sidon is going to be better than you. Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be better than you. Capernaum, you're damned. As you go from Mark into Matthew, you can watch the invective escalate. And I think what's going on is the more opposition that a community writing a gospel or involved in a gospel is getting, the nastier their Jesus is. You can watch that whole progress. It doesn't all start in Revelation. It's going on through the Gospels. Jesus is getting steadily nastier. But the incident in the temple is a prophetic sign. It is not violence. Turning over the money changers does nothing except really, piss off the people involved. But it's a dramatic destruction of the fiscal basis of the temple. It's like the Berrigan brothers going in, pouring blood on a draft card. It doesn't stop Vietnam. It doesn't stop the Pentagon. It just really bothers the people who have to clean up, I suppose. But it's a demonstration. It's a prophetic demonstration. It's not violence.
Let me come back to one issue that I made in my lecture. The idea of empire, the definition of empire is this belief that there is no alternative. It may well be the conservatives believe this more fervently, there is no alternative, and then you get perhaps a certain viciousness coming out of this. Of course, liberals also buy into this all the time, right? We assume that this is the only option here. When we talk about capitalism, we very quickly are made to assume that's going to be our solution. And if you look at Robert Reich, who came up, you can describe the problem, but many economists would still say you will solve this by having more capitalism or better capitalism and so on. Okay. What we have to keep in mind is that there are different sorts of capitalism, like your diagram showed. That perhaps we have to be in dialogue with some other ways of thinking. I have these 15-year-old twin girls, and for some time they brought together a group of teenage theologians. And they said, well, the first question that this group always raises with me is, they say, I have this question which I could never ask in church. So they feel like now they can raise these questions. The very first question that ever came from this group was Jesus a Marxist revolutionary? Mm-hmm. Why would these kids get this idea, right? Teenagers. Was Jesus a Marxist revolutionary? Which gave me the opportunity to say, well, you have it backwards, right? Chronologically. Jesus Jesus was before Marx, but a lot of our socialist traditions do have Christian roots, if you follow that, There is something where Christianity opens up these closed systems that we can appreciate. And if the one thing we take away from this is that this belief that there is no alternative is no longer valid, that we take some courage and ask these questions and open up perhaps a discussion between different forms of economics, between different forms of religion, between different understandings of God, we'd really have something.
I was just wondering, too, whether, since both of these authors, the epidemiologists, are British, whether they wanted an American, some American, maybe they chose the wrong one, I didn't know that, to put a preface or a prologue for sales in this country. They picked the wrong one, you're right. I didn't know that.
Friends, if you're experiencing some frustration and some impatience and some extreme wish to go deeper in any part of this, you're in the right place. We would like to invite you to be refreshed this evening, to come back afresh tomorrow. We're going to go much deeper into this. There'll be much more microphone justice than there was tonight. I apologize. I think we owe our presenters who traveled today a huge round of applause. And we will say to you tonight, go in peace, for peace, be back early, and we will begin the work together tomorrow. Thank you all very much.